Hello everybody, this is Learning to Excel with another video for you. In this video we're just going to go over the basics of creating and manipulating pivot tables. And so where we want to start is basically we have our fictional company information here once again, and we would like to create a pivot table so we can do some specific analysis and filtering on this data. So the first step to creating a pivot table, you always want to select the entire spreadsheet, because a lot of times you're going to be keeping a working file and you're going to be adding data to it later on, and it's really useful if you select the entire sheet so that as you add data, say at the bottom of this data set, as time moves forward, you can just refresh your pivot tables at a later date, and you won't have to continually recreate and worry that your pivot table is missing any data. So we selected our whole spreadsheet by clicking this corner here. We're going to go ahead and say Insert Pivot Table. And so this is just saying it's looking at this tab and it's grabbing these columns the whole way down. So we just say OK. And so here's what the pivot table field looks like. So what we're going to do is just go over some basic examples of how we could look at this data. Say we want to know, by employee. We want to put that in the rows column, so that's going to list the employees down the row. How much money and contracts each of these employees brought in the year. So we would drop contract value in this column. And as you can see, this pivot table is actually creating a count rather than a sum of the value of all the contracts. So we can change this by just clicking, left-clicking this specific area in the pivot table, going into value field settings, and instead of count we're going to go ahead and say sum. So this is going to go ahead and change the pivot table parameters, and it's going to sum all those values. So here we are, we have the sum of the values, and I'd like to look at this as dollars, so we're going to go ahead and create dollars, and there's no real need to have pennies in there in my opinion. So we see $126.5 million in contracts, and it's broken out by all our different sales representatives. So other ways you can manipulate this data, if you don't like what it's displaying, you can just grab your row data and throw it out, and as you can see, grab your sum contract value and throw it out. Now we just have a new pivot table again. So maybe we want to know, by country, the amount of contract value that's being brought in, so that we can properly identify who our target markets are. So in this case, again, it's switched back to its default of count, so you can go ahead and go in here and change it back to sum. It's going to do that. See our same numbers. So now it's by country. So there's endless ways you can manipulate this data. You could add, based on these countries, which employees are bringing in the contracts for these countries. You can drop the employee right beneath the customer, and so now it's going to show for the $2.5 million in Australian contracts all the employees that brought in money, and you can easily identify, Mike appears to be the most effective at bringing in Australian contracts, so we can go talk to him and see what he's doing that is generating such higher capture of contracts than everybody else in our organization. So the last thing you can also do to drill into pivot tables is, say, I have 6.5 million in New Zealand contracts. I want to know, all the detail behind this $6 million in contracts. We can actually drill into pivot tables by double clicking, and it's going to go ahead and pull in from the original data sheet the information specific to New Zealand, and it's going to have, the widgets, the employees, the data, the contracts, contract value, commissions paid, etc. So you can pivot tables are really dynamic. You can do a lot of things with them, and it's basically down to your own creativity, the limits of pivot tables. A couple more quick things I wanted to show you guys. A lot of times at work you need to create reports for individual employees, say for year-end reviews, something like that. I want to show you guys a really quick way that you can do that. So by adding the employee to the filters of our pivot table here, we can actually have Excel generate individual pivot tables for each employee, the amount of contract value they've brought in, since the inception of the contract or the company. By clicking and putting employees in the filter, we're going to go into pivot table tools. We're going to go to options, show report filter pages. We want the employees, so we're going to go ahead and click OK. And you can watch and see as Excel builds individual pivot tables for each employee, which you could then review in year-end reviews or things of that nature. So I think that's a really useful tool. And then the last thing I want to cover with you guys is going to be, and it creates this blank one here, you can just delete that. So for our full up data here, a lot of times when you're reporting this sort of information in meetings, etc., people like to see data graphically rather than in a pivot table like this. So Excel has this really useful tool called Pivot Chart. And so while you're clicked into your pivot table, you can hit Pivot Chart, and it'll actually create graphs for you, and you have all these different types of charts to choose from. And you can actually create these dynamic charts which will show the information on this pivot table in a more easy to digest manner. This easily tells me that the U.S. is our prime customer, and China and France and are second and third in that regard. It's just a more effective way of looking at the information. And again, you can even filter information in here. Say I want to know just Barbara Thatcher, her contract value additions for us, and we can see those numbers. It's just a very dynamic way of looking at data, and very useful. So this concludes this video. Go ahead and leave us any comments or suggestions you'd like. If this video is helpful, if you'd like to learn more about pivot tables, and we look forward to seeing you guys next time. Thanks.